Hey guys, today we are going to review plant systems. There's a lot of things that we talked about with plants, so we're going to go over all the big points of the stuff that we learned about in class. So first off, let's just remind ourselves what makes a plant a plant. Remember that in order to tell the difference between a plant and some other kind of organism, you have to look microscopically at their cells. Particularly, there are three different things that you could look for in the cells. You could look for a cell wall, which helps the plant maintain its structure and give support. There's chloroplasts, which help the plant go through photosynthesis. And then there's your large central vacuole where your plant can store things like water and nutrients. Next, let's go ahead and go over the basic parts of the plant and what they do. So let's begin with the roots. Remember that the roots are below the ground, and those are in charge of anchoring the plant to the ground, as well as absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. Remember that your plant has to take in specific minerals from the soil. So when you water your plant, the water dissolves those minerals, and so the minerals are now located inside the water, and then the roots just suck that up. After the roots comes the stems, which help to provide structure and support. The stems help to position your leaves to collect sunlight. And then, as we'll come to later, your stems are also responsible for transporting all of those nutrients and the water and things that your roots suck up. Next is the leaf. The leaf is in charge of trapping energy from the sun to make food or glucose. Remember that process is called photosynthesis. And then this is also the site of gas exchange in your plant. Your leaves have little pores all over them, little holes where oxygen is able to go out and carbon dioxide is able to go in. Lastly, we have our flower, and your flower contains all of the reproductive structures of your plant. And we'll go into detail a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Okay, the next thing I want to review with you are the plant systems. Remember that there are three systems located inside your plant. We've got the shoot system, the root system, and the reproductive system. Your shoot system is everything above the ground, and your root system is everything below the ground. And then your reproductive system would be flowers, or if you have a plant that doesn't have flowers, typically they'll use cones. So let's talk about what a plant actually needs to survive. In order to survive, your plant needs water and it needs nutrients. It gets a lot of this from the ground. Remember, like I just said, those minerals in the soil, your plant gets those through the water, but your plant also needs sugar to survive. Sugar is like the food of your plant. So in order to get that sugar, we need sunlight and we need air. That process is photosynthesis, which we have learned in a previous unit this year, but just in case you need a reminder, there's the formula for photosynthesis. Now let's think for just a second about those systems of the plant. In order to get water and nutrients from the soil, we're going to use the root system. In order to make sugar, we're going to use the shoot system. So we have to have a way to move food from the shoot system down to the roots, and we have to have a way to move the water from the root system up to the shoot system, and that is where the next part of this lesson comes into play. The next part of this lesson talks about our vascular tissues. Vascular tissues are the things that you have inside your plant stem that help to move things around. This is very similar to our bloodstream in human beings. With this vascular tissue, there are two kinds. We've got xylem, which helps transport water and minerals up. So this starts in the roots and goes up. And then phloem, which helps to transport that sugar, that food, from the leaves where photosynthesis happens to the rest of the plant. So phloem can go in two directions because sometimes you have leaves that are at the bottom of the plant. Sometimes you have leaves that are at the top of the plant, and that food is kind of just going to go everywhere. So it can go up or it can go down. It is very important that you remember the directions that these go because they are two completely different vascular tissues. The same way we have veins and we have arteries. Arteries move blood away from the heart, and veins move blood to the heart. They go in different directions. So when we talk about that xylem, remember that xylem is carrying water and minerals from the soil, and it's going upward. In order for that xylem to move things upward, your plant is going to go through a process called transpiration. Transpiration is like when you suck on a straw and pull water through the straw. So when it comes to transpiration, we're going to take in water at the very, very bottom of the plant, and it's going to move all the way up the plant until it gets to the leaves. And when it gets to the leaves, it can leave the plant in those little tiny pores called stomata. The same place where your gas exchange happens, we can lose water out of the plant. Now, sometimes this is good if you live in a place where there's a lot of water, like a rainforest or something. But sometimes this is bad, especially if you live in somewhere like the desert. And so your plant has made adaptations, your plants in the desert have made adaptations to protect themselves from this transpiration. They've got little cells that close those stomata so that water cannot escape, and those are called guard cells. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is reproduction. Remember that in a plant, in your flower, which is where all your reproductive parts are, you've got both male parts and you've got female parts. So your male parts are the anther and the filament, and when you put those together, we call it the stamen. And your female parts are the stigma, the style, and the ovary. When we put those together, it's called the pistil, or sometimes it is called the carpel. Now let's talk about what each of these parts does. So we'll start with the female parts. Your female parts are your stigma, your style, and your ovary. The stigma is a sticky end sticking out of the plant. That's whole job is just to have pollen stick to it. It's catching pollen, basically. Once pollen gets stuck to that stigma, it's going to travel down the style. Style is kind of like a little tube, a pollen tube. It's going to travel all the way down the style and into the ovary. The ovary is what produces that female sex cell. So speaking of sex cell, pollen is your male sex cell. So when you have a pollen granule match up with the ovule, you're going to end up creating a seed, which is how your plant is going to reproduce. Now, if we think about the male parts, your anther's whole job is just to make that pollen. So the anther makes the pollen, and it's going to get transferred to a stigma. Your filament's job is to hold that anther up as high as it can in the plant. Because the higher up that anther is, the more likely it is that a bug is going to accidentally touch it, or wind is going to carry that pollen out of the flower. So we want those really high up. We don't want them hidden down in the bottom of the plant. Now, lastly, I also want to talk about petals, which are the big bright things on your flower, and those are in charge of just attracting pollinators. We want to attract bugs like bees. We want to attract birds like little hummingbirds and bats and things like that to help us to carry that pollen and help the plant pollinate. And then lastly, you have the sepal. The sepal is the outer layer that protects your flower. When you have a bud, a flower that hasn't bloomed yet and it looks green, those green pieces are your sepal. And then when that flower opens up, the sepal goes down to the bottom. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to cover today is tropisms. Remember that a tropism is a response, a plant's response to some kind of stimulus. Tropisms are movements of the plant that are caused by that cause a change in the plant's growth. These can be positive or negative. If the plant is moving towards the stimulus, that's positive. If it's moving away from the stimulus, that's negative. Okay, so there are four. The first one is geotropism, which also is called gravitropism. I know in my class I normally say the word gravitropism, and that's the plant's response to gravity. Gravitropism is actually positive and negative at the same time. Your top part of the plant that's growing upwards would be negative. It's going against gravity. The roots of the plant grow downwards, so that would be positive, growing towards gravity. The second one is hydrotropism, and this is the movement towards water. Your plant is always going to bend and move towards the water, specifically the roots, because that's where your plant sucks up water. So those roots are going to grow towards any source of water that they can sense. So that would be a positive tropism because we're moving towards something. The third is thigmotropism, which is response to touch. Again, this can be positive or this can be negative. If your plant is, let's say, a vine that's wrapping around a pole or climbing up a wall, it is using touch and moving towards the touch to go upward. That would be a positive tropism. But there are plants like the one we looked at in class where you can touch it and that plant closes up or moves away from you. That would be a negative tropism. And then the last one is phototropism. Phototropism is a response to light. So your plant is going to bend and turn to try to get as much light as possible. The best example of this is a sunflower. Those sunflowers move throughout the day following the sun. That way they can soak up as much sunlight as possible and do as much photosynthesis as possible. Okay, that is it for plant systems. Please make sure you watch this video as many times as you need to. After this, there will be an activity for you to do, a discussion post, and then there will be a quiz at the very, very end to make sure that you got all this information. All right.